Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Anissa Hemming. I'm the director of the Center for Green Schools at the U.S. Green Building Council. Our offices are located in Washington, D.C., joining you from a conference down in Austin, Texas, with Jonathan Klein, who will introduce himself in a bit. And thank you guys for joining us. We're excited to be here to talk about the greening of America's schools and the place that K-12 schools have in this conversation about climate action and the climate emergency. So we're going to dive right in. Excited to get your questions as well, if you want to send those in through the Q&A on if you're on the Zoom. And we're hoping to have a couple minutes at the end to answer any questions you guys have. Click into this presentation. So where we're headed today, we're going to spend some time on introductions so you know who we are and what perspectives we bring to this work. And then we're going to walk through some key guiding questions about this sector and the climate emergency. So, you know, why do K-12 schools matter in the conversation? What are the best opportunities? Where are the bright spots? You know, how are we going to act? So we're excited to get into these questions with you, and we'll walk through these questions very explicitly as we go. So on the line today, I'll be moderating our session and presenting some information as well. We also have Jonathan Klein, who's the co-founder of OnDemand K12, and Riley Loveland, who is New Buildings Institute. And we're going to spend a little bit of time here at the beginning just letting you know who we are, so that, again, you have the context to understand what we bring to this. So on my side, the Center for Green Schools is housed at the U.S. Green Building Council, which is a nonprofit that has a mission to advance sustainable and healthy communities through green buildings and green community infrastructure. So that includes the LEED green building rating system that many of you might know. The Center for Green Schools was founded at USGBC around 11 years ago. We focus on professional development and peer networking for professionals who work at school systems who are doing the sustainability work at those school systems. And from there, we do also some advocacy work and research related to their impacts at their school systems. We post our educational online on-demand education on USGBC's education site, and a lot of green building resources and education available at this site. So I encourage you to visit it if you'd like to know more about green schools and the impact of buildings on health and energy and climate issues. And I'll pass it over to Jonathan so he can introduce himself.
Thanks for the invitation to participate today, Anissa, and great to be with you as well, Riley. As you guys know, I come to this conversation first as a parent and an educator. I've spent my adult life working as a teacher, a district leader, an organizer, and a nonprofit executive. And in September 2019, before the pandemic times, my then 7th grade daughter asked me to chaperone her and her friends at the San Francisco climate strike. Now, at that time, our family in Northern California already had N95 masks in our backpacks and in our cars before the pandemic because of the fire and smoke season that has become a challenging, regular feature of California life due to rising temperatures and persistent drought. I was radicalized that day, walking among thousands of young people of all backgrounds, hearing their urgent, ambitious calls to action. I'm 46 years old, and I'm part of a generation of adults with extraordinary formal authority to respond to those young people's call to action. I set out to understand the intersection of educational equity and climate change. We can go to the next slide. And today, I'm the co-founder of Undaunted K12. We're a national nonprofit supporting schools to transition to zero emissions while preparing young people to build sustainable futures given rapidly changing climate. At Undaunted, we are ambitious policy advocates. We're working to support systems leaders with technical assistance, and we're building a network of public and private sector partners to work with urgency, creativity, and hopefully competence to support our schools to make this transition.
Great. Riley?
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here. What an awesome opportunity. My name is Riley Loveland. I'm the schools lead for New Buildings Institute, and New Buildings Institute is a US-based national nonprofit organization, and we work to reduce energy and carbon emissions in both new and existing buildings, sometimes confusing because our name is New Buildings Institute. I'm actually coming to you today from Portland, Oregon, and for over 20 years, we at NBI have been researching and defining the best practices in building science. We partner with owners, designers, utilities, school districts, public agencies, other nonprofits like who we have here today to develop the market by highlighting what has been learned through the design guidance. We implement case studies and workshops. We do speaking engagements like this one so that we can then influence relevant codes and policies so that the market is transformed for everyone. And I'll just tell y'all a little that the photos that Jonathan showed are my why. They're why I'm here. Schools and in particular students have so much to teach us, and we'll spend about the next hour telling you why.
That's right. So we start with the question of why. So we know from working across sectors at the U.S. Green Building Council that there's a question always when we start talking about schools, why that sector? Because we have dedicated quite a lot of our energy around the K12 sector. And so this is a pretty important question for those that work in the climate space, because we know that the K12 sector is often not brought into the conversations around climate planning, climate action planning. So one reason for why is the scale of K through 12 infrastructure, the scale and the exposure of many people within our communities that schools have. So schools are a central place in the community. They are a huge investment of public dollars. They have a lot of land and a lot of square footage of buildings. And so the scale of impact is huge, and many people are exposed to the impacts that they have. The built environment as a whole has a huge impact on carbon emissions and on several other environmental metrics. And our school buildings have a related impact, obviously. And then when you talk about schools, you're also talking across buildings and grounds and transportation. So the school systems have a large impact on carbon emissions. So I'm going to toss it back over to Riley to give you a preview of what she's going to talk about later.
You know, Anissa painted the scale really well, that schools really branch across all different types of emissions, and they're really not small contributors to the total emissions in the United States. We estimate that the current emissions associated with the operation of public K-12 schools is approximately 42 million metric tons of CO2e, or CO2 equivalent. Next slide. And I'll get back to that later. So if decarbonization is implemented and we really accelerate these K-12 schools and act on this opportunity, it has the potential to create millions of these family sustaining jobs across a range of skill levels and job types in every community in America. Schools are such an opportunity to change an entire workforce. Energy efficiency and renewable energy jobs already far exceed that of fossil energy jobs. In 2020, there were actually 3 million jobs in clean energy and energy efficiency, compared to less than half that many in fossil energy.
That's right. So we've gone through the reasons for investing in schools and thinking about them related to climate action planning, related to the scale, related to the potential for emissions reductions, related to jobs. Obviously, our schools are also places that deeply impact the health and wellness of our students. So any investment in the environment of the schools is going to be an investment in our students and our teachers' health and well-being, and their ability to succeed when it comes to the educational mission of schools. The other aspects of why this matters is again, that central role that schools play in communities. So every school that is designed with their community in mind, and sort of the impact that they are having on their community, that the community is having on them, model that they are showing to their community, that's a very powerful relationship. And so whenever we are acting responsibly at schools, that has ripple effects throughout a community. There are also great reasons to center schools within the climate emergency action. There are impacts related to community resilience that schools very uniquely address. So it's a great example in Nashville that has saved 15% or so on energy across their district by implementing automation systems, and also by implementing demand energy response, which is when there's a large surge in energy need, the utility can adjust how much a large entity like a school system is using. That's a community resilience response that is possible because of the scale of our community schools. And it's also a great example for the rest of the community. There's another cool example from Minneapolis. This school had this amazing solar garden project that could be bought in by its low-income community surrounding the school, reducing the amount that was spent on utilities by those residents. This project was so successful that now the developer of this solar garden project is working with the city to create a solar and battery storage center for the district offices, elementary and middle school campus that is going to be able to serve as a community resilience center. So again, these like central places that schools hold can be really powerful placement of this kind of action. And then there's obviously a whole realm of benefits and imperatives around climate action at schools that have to do with the educational mission of schools. So I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan to walk you through some of that.
Thanks. So young people today will pursue jobs, hold decision-making authority, and start families during the next 3 decades, when the world is expected to experience the continued intensification of climate change impacts. So the preparation they receive today can arm them with the mindsets, knowledge and skills to navigate these impacts and contribute to solutions. And this will have massive implications for our global workforce and economy. Let's go to the next slide. As Anissa and Riley shared, K12 schools they're big infrastructure, and K12 Climate Action is about getting to zero emissions with our buildings and transportation and food. But perhaps most importantly, it's about preparing young people for life. Andrea Yagoyan at the San Mateo County Office of Education in California often points to this quote from Professor David Orr: "The planetary emergency unfolding around us is first and foremost a crisis of thought, values, perception, ideas, and judgment. In other words, it's a crisis of our mind, which makes it a crisis of those institutions which purport to improve minds. If the world becomes what we teach, then schools have an essential role to play." Next slide, please, Nisa. So education leaders, we need to align our standards and curriculum to the skills needed for success in the green economy, green jobs. But schools are also transformational places where young people can develop the mindsets to lead sustainable lives and envision new skills for systems and structures for sustainable and just communities and economies. And climate change, as we've been talking about throughout this whole conference, will affect every part of our society, from care to agriculture to business. And ensuring students are prepared to live and succeed must become core to schools' educational mission. We're preparing young people for both new jobs that are going to come into existence and be created, but also for all the existing jobs that are going to have new components and new skills and require new mindsets given the climate and sustainability imperative. Next slide, please. So we've got pretty broad support in the US for climate education. In 2019, pre-pandemic, 80% of parents and 86% of teachers thought that climate change and its effects on the environment and society should be taught in schools. Additionally, 78% of adults believe that schools should teach about the causes, consequences, and potential solutions to global warming. But we have some work to do. Despite strong support for teaching, only 42% of teachers reported teaching climate change in their classes. This is also important because 57% of young people report that climate change makes them feel afraid. At the same time, 54% say that it makes them feel motivated to take action. So learning about climate solutions and how to take climate action can help students combat eco-anxiety, which is the persistent worry about their future and the prospects for future generations. Yet, teens report, most of them, that they have learned little or nothing about how to reduce the effects of climate change in school. Next slide, please. Thanks. But we're following them, right? As we see on the news, in our streets, on our social media feeds, youth are leading movements for climate action and climate justice. In 2019, 1 in 4 teenagers in the US reported voicing their opinions on climate change. In 2021, 32% of adults in Gen Z reported personally taking action to address climate change in the past year. Students around this country are asking schools to address climate change so they can better understand and solve the problems they see in our communities. And finally, individuals receiving just one year of intensive climate change education made individual decisions which resulted in a reduction of 2.86 tons, or the equivalent of CO2, each year. Imagine if we had committed to system-wide climate education 20 years ago. So the time to accelerate and scale is now.
Thanks, Jonathan. So we want to know, how are schools doing related to being ready, and specifically in the US? And the what we know mostly comes from financial data related to how much has been invested in schools per square foot of school space that we estimate. So we're going to go on just a little bit of like a context setting on how large the challenge is in the United States related to schools. So this information comes from a 2021 State of Our Schools report, which was put up by 21st Century School Fund and its partners, who assess the financial data of school buildings on the capital improvement side and on the operations and maintenance side. And they identified an enormous gap in what has been spent versus what should have been spent based on the amount of square footage that exists. So the deficiency in spending is enormous, to the tune of about $82 billion per year deficit. So the real challenge and concern also is where that gap is happening. And this is related to a topic that I'm sure has come up again and again in all of the programming that you've attended at COP, and certainly that I've seen around climate justice, because the local school districts in the United States are almost entirely responsible for upkeep of their schools and keeping their schools safe and healthy. Some states provide some funding to help even the playing field, and the federal government provides pretty much nothing to help with that equity issue across communities. So, where there is a well community, there's low investment in school buildings and school environments. And these are environments that, again, 1 in 6 people step foot in every day in the United States, and our most vulnerable population, our students, are spending many hours a day and are required to spend many hours a day in these buildings. So if we take a look at that, the district poverty rating, so just to clarify here, high poverty would be high. That's not high income, that's high poverty. High poverty districts and medium poverty districts spend quite a lot less on maintenance and operations and on construction than their peers in low poverty districts and higher wealth districts. So the money does sort of follow the logic of the fact that locals are responsible for their investment in their buildings. The other thing that we're seeing is that rural school districts, because they have such low tax base, mostly because they have such low tax base, are spending way less than their peers in towns, suburbs, and cities on their school buildings. So, if you were to go to a poorer rural school district, those are the worst condition buildings that certainly I've seen in the field, but also what it looks like from the funding. Those are the schools that we really should be concerned about their condition. And without funding to do these basic things, they're not able to invest in the sort of climate forward thinking sometimes that we want them to be able to invest in. And then finally, not only is this a money issue, but obviously if it's a money issue, it's often tied to race. And so there is strong evidence that the high poverty districts are also the districts where they're overrepresented by high minority districts. So, where the issue is happening is in poor minority serving districts. And this is where the imperative here around climate justice comes into play. And this is our challenge. Our challenge is that school districts often do not have the funding to invest anything, and in particular, anything toward climate action. There are exceptions, and we're going to go into those exceptions next and the possible solutions that we have seen in the field through our work. So before we go there, we're going to look at what the estimated impacts, if we do that action, are, so we really understand what the implications are for this action at schools. So I'm going to toss it over to Riley so she can outline that.
Thanks, Anissa. I know Anissa painted a pretty rough picture of the state of our schools, but the bright light here is that many school districts around the US have really started understanding the opportunities in their building stock and considering their emissions. And they're looking at those that are within both their direct and indirect control. So just for some context here, buildings have both direct and indirect emissions. Direct comes from fuels combusted on site, such as the actual combustion in the buildings, like fossil fuels, or your school fleet, which is that scope 1 on the left, or indirect emissions, which is that scope 2 there in the middle, which is electricity purchased and generated off-site. Some schools are even looking into their scope 3 emissions, which are travel, procurement, waste, water. But today we're just kind of going to focus on scope 1 and 2 because that's really in the within the scope of what can be tapped today. If you want to go to the next slide. And as the second largest form of public infrastructure after roads and highways, which seems like a crazy amount of infrastructure, K12 schools offer this sizable opportunity within the public sector to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, K12 schools are spending at least $8 billion on energy. That's billion with a B. And it's actually likely higher because those numbers are a couple years old. So imagine what could be spent on instead of energy and the emissions impact from those reductions. School buses also represent the largest fleet of public transportation with, I think, just shy of about 500,000 largely diesel buses in need of electrification. And as we seek to organize this coordinated effort at all levels of the government, K12 schools and the school buses fall within that public span of control. Next slide, please. So to illustrate these concepts and provide the emissions context to really understand the impact that schools can have, NBI, Adante K12, and the Coalition for Climate Education Policy developed a white paper and an emissions inventory. And while our K12 schools are responsible for what feels like a modest share of overall building and transportations in the US, emissions in the US, it still is a lot. It's a big number. And as I outlined above, this sector is positioned to catalyze increased awareness. I know Anissa talked about this, Jonathan talked about this. Those signs from those students were so impactful. They're here to catalyze public support, workforce development, innovation, and then, of course, most critically, the shifts in mindset that form the foundation for any success that we might envision. Next, please. And I know we showed this earlier, but again, we estimate that the current emissions associated with the operation, again, operation is kind of the key word there, of public K-12 schools is approximately this 42 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Next slide. And within this white paper, I'm not going to spend too much time diving into the specifics of the methodology because it's outlined pretty extensively in the paper itself. But I did want to highlight a couple of key concepts that are really relevant here. And that's that public school buildings represent 7.8 billion square feet of building space. That's again, billion with a B. And I mentioned public schools. I do want to call this out because they are within that jurisdiction of state, local, or federal authority. However, independent, charter, private schools, all types of educational facilities, higher ed, community college play a very important role here too. So although we're focused on K-12, public K-12, this applies beyond that as well. So we utilize Census Division specific estimates of site energy use so that we're able to get a more accurate understanding of the true emissions by fuel type for each state. So a fairly simplified way to explain this is that we took the square footage of the public K-12 schools by the Census Division, multiplied that by the types of fuel consumption, and then took the emissions factors of each of the fuel types to get the amount of emissions by K-12 buildings per state. That's a lot to say and understand quickly. We will pass on this white paper to you so that you're able to dive into that methodology. I suspect a lot of people on the call are really interested in the nitty-gritty of this. If you want to go to the next slide. So this is the list by state. This is what's feeding into that 42 million metric tons. And it's again important to note that this is from building operations only. And imagine the impact when you also consider the scope 3 emissions, the indirect emissions, and also when you take into account those additional private and independent schools, higher ed, community college. This is just the slice of the pie. Public schools, by the way, represent about 85% of the square footage of K-12 schools. So that private independent charter would be an additional 15% of the impact on emissions, plus higher ed, community college. You want to go on to the next slide? Great.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be you again, Riley, but I was going to introduce, okay, so that's what the impact can be. So let's look at, what are the best opportunities to actually do something about this emissions class.
Classically, I muted myself and then got stuck. So how do we act? Where do we start? Let me again kind of like set some background here. This is the bright spot piece. That since 2010, New Buildings Institute has been tracking one subset of high performance buildings, these zero energy buildings. And a zero energy building is an energy efficient building that produces as much energy as it consumes over the course of a year. So since 2012, our list has grown quite exponentially, and all of these buildings are aiming for this ambitious goal. And we have learned a lot from this data set. And most importantly, we have learned that it is possible to design, construct, and operate zero energy buildings no matter where you are in the country, and that you can learn from those who have already done it. Next slide. We've also learned that across the country, schools are leading the way in zero energy, and that more than a third of the buildings on this list are schools or educational buildings. Next slide. And I know with the statistics, I was talking a lot about the operations of the building, but I did kind of want to talk about economy scale decarbonization because that really goes beyond the operation of the building and takes into account connections to the grid and the embodied carbon that's actually embedded in the materials in the construction process. So we like to call these the 5 foundations of building decarbonization, where it's the efficiency of your building systems, the renewables to offset use, electrification of traditionally combustion-based systems. We got to get the fossil fuels out of these buildings, grid management and load and grid harmonization, and then again, those embodied carbon of the actual construction materials. Next slide. And achieving zero carbon will require retrofitting existing systems, building new buildings with all electric high performance systems, embracing those carbon-free renewables, those low embodied carbon materials, and transitioning the diesel school bus fleet to zero emission options. And I want to be pretty clear that I know that I mentioned zero energy and zero carbon is this end goal. It's the carbon-free renewables. It is going completely carbon-free. Zero energy is a very important part of that pie because you're offsetting your use. So zero carbon is the end goal, and zero energy is a part of this pie. Next slide. So with school districts, this is the trickier part, but actually it's not very tricky because it's much easier if school districts think about this strategically. It's that strategic portfolio approach to their energy and emissions reduction. So, federal governments, states, localities, and districts can help set or need to set these clear decarbonization goals and develop a long-term roadmap or a long-term climate action plan that investigates how these big, bold goals filter down into everyday actions into the individual buildings across the portfolio. So a decarbonization roadmap helps identify these cost-effective strategies and approaches to achieve the goals across the portfolio of buildings. And to do this, you leverage every natural opportunity in a building life cycle, like new construction, retrofits, system replacements, major modernizations to continue to improve energy performance and drive down emissions. And again, this makes it significantly more cost effective because you're doing this however you can, and it aligns directly with those broad school district goals and plans that are already in place. Next slide. And I mentioned that NBI list above, which really does showcase that which exists is possible. And I just want to make it again really clear that these buildings are possible because in addition to our list, the US Department of Energy and the National Renewable Energy Lab did a deep dive into the 88 school zero energy projects. And what they found was that these schools can be designed and built on conventional school budgets and sometimes even under budget. So that strategic approach and considering energy and carbon from the beginning of the process can help design teams make these buildings cost effective, and not just from the beginning of the process, but throughout every decision that's made. I know I mentioned some of the construction trigger points in school building design, but it can also be like a school board turnover or some other opportunity that presents itself to help continually drive these down and make it more cost effective. And this really helps us get beyond that perceived barrier of these schools being far too expensive. They are not more expensive. They can be, of course, because any school could be more expensive. But what we've seen is that these can be designed and built on those conventional school budgets. Next slide. So in our work with these leading districts across the country, we work with districts quite literally across the country from the north to the south to the east to the west. We've noticed that there are some key approaches that help support the decarbonization roadmap and the climate action plans and actually implementing these in the districts. And one of those key approaches I just mentioned is to start early, but all of these can be factored into this road mapping and this planning process. It's really about involving your stakeholders, finding that champion, understanding what is going on in your building stock and continually benchmarking and tracking performance, setting those goals and incorporating them into your policies and plans and practices, aligning them with those building life cycle events that I talked about, always engaging the occupants. Anissa and Jonathan have talked a lot about how the students play such an important role here. I mean, arguably they're the most important role here. And then continuing to track and report your progress so that you know where you are, where you need to go, and that everyone in the district is brought along with you. And if you want to go to the next slide. So this is what in K12 school districts or in any school district, higher ed, community college, cities, a decarbonization roadmap can kind of look like this. So again, you're assessing your performance, setting those specific time-bound goals. You'll see that we put 2045 in here as an end goal, but you can choose whatever it may be. You want to go for 2030? Go for it. Set those specific time-bound goals for those different construction points, and then align them in the goals, policy, planning, and practices that is commonly used across the school facilities and these different construction points to get to that goal of a decarbonized portfolio over time. And we've seen it happen. It's in process all over the nation. You absolutely can do it. And we encourage all of you on this call, on this listening into our webinar to help push your districts towards this end goal. And I think that's it from me.
Yeah, so let's talk about where it has happened. We do have several school district and school examples that we can point to of places where the successful approach that Riley was just outlining is underway and is being planned for. So there is a tracker that there's a link here that I can we'll send out to anyone who wants it, to school board resolutions that have been passed since 2017 related to climate action. Here are a couple of really recent examples from Miami, Oakland, a private school in Hawaii, Salt Lake City, and LA Unified. I'll point out that each of these schools and districts that are outlined here that you can read through on the screen has a person identified within their school district for sustainability. And this is something that the Center for Green Schools has been working on for the last 11 years is ensuring that school districts see the benefit to having a person identified who is a sustainability champion within their school system. That person can be laying the groundwork for these types of plans when they're able to be passed. So in the case of, say, Salt Lake City, there was a gentleman there who's been working for years on energy management, on educational connections with their energy and environment work, and has been piecing things together with the resources that he had to work with over the last decade or so. And some school stakeholders, students, parents, and teachers raised up to the school board that they wanted the school board to take firmer action on climate and set emissions goals for the district. And the district was ready to do that and ready to set those goals because of the groundwork that gentleman had put in place for the decade before. So having the wherewithal within the district, within district staff, and having people ready to go within these school districts is essential to getting these plans actually rolled out. But the other component there, obviously, were those parents, students, and teachers who were demanding the action. So the interaction between the advocacy and the preparation on the side of the district is really essential to getting these plans moving. So Riley's going to walk you through one example in particular with some data to sort of show how the emissions reductions have been approached at one district.
I would say too on that list, I just kind of wanted to quickly add one of the schools, Oakland Unified, actually also declared a climate emergency resolution in October of 2020. I think that is really telling that a district that they've been through quite a few ups and downs over the years, and that they were able to pass a resolution like that and move forward is pretty outstanding. All of these districts are really outstanding, and there's many. I mean, Anissa's got a list of 72 plus school board resolutions and more pass every day. I'll tell you about one here in a second, though. You can go to the next slide now. Thank you. So for some background, NBI, one of our initiatives is that we started a cohort of school districts in California that were developing their roadmaps to zero carbon. We did this with the Division of the State Architect in California, which was a great partnership. I see that my numbers got a little messed up on here, but that's okay. I'll just recite them. One of the participants was Lake Tahoe Unified. Two of the participants were actually Oakland and Los Angeles on the last slide, which is really cool. So we're really hitting it home here today. But Lake Tahoe Unified, we were brought in because there was an interested school board member actually that participated. We had people of all different types of jobs at the school district. We had superintendents, facility managers, but this school board member came in and said that they were interested. They were having a hard time getting much passed because they had a lot of trees and they were having a hard time getting solar bought into and things like that. And so we came in and looked at their energy use intensity, which for anyone that is not familiar with energy use intensity, it's the total energy used in the school district, which is electricity and gas, combined into kilobTUs per square foot. So that's the square footage of the school. And an average one that we see, the K12 average median, or the national median in K12 schools in the United States is 48. In California, it's about 42. When we're looking at zero energy buildings, we're talking in the 20 to 25 range, and Lake Tahoe had an EUI of 92. So we knew it was time to get after it and kind of figure out what to do. So if you want to go to the next slide. So we went to the school board and other people in the district and said, like, You guys are spending almost $1 million on energy per year, which is actually quite a bit for that many facilities. And so they're spending about $3,000 a day on utilities and energy, which is compared to the national average quite a bit. And so we worked with them. We developed a resolution that was passed for climate and carbon neutrality. We have developed these guiding standards so that they're able to utilize them for those building life cycle points I mentioned. So every time one of those comes up, they have a guiding document that guides them like, oh, we have a new construction. We need to have that energy use intensity of 20. We need to make sure that we are using XYZ for our insulation values and things like that. So that's been really helpful to help them guide the process. They actually engaged an energy services company to help with the 5-year plan to really drive down the energy use. We don't have the data yet, but we're already seeing results from the initial energy use. We always talk about picking the low-hanging fruit first. There's always low-hanging fruit to pick. And then with that, if you want to go to the next slide, these are some of the goals, for example, that we set. These were the ones in the actual resolution. So all of their new construction will be zero energy capable, be all electric. There's that key thing for decarbonization, and have an energy use intensity of 25 kilobtu per square foot per year. We think that you could do 20 to 25. The Advanced Energy Design Guide for zero energy schools that the National Renewable Energy Lab put out, they actually said most schools can be in the 20 to 25 range. And I think the highest was like Alaska, and it was like 25.8. So something like that. I wouldn't quote me on that, but it's well within that 25 range for new construction, so that their modernizations or deep energy retrofits will achieve an EUI of 30 kBtu per square foot. And then over the next few years, they're going to reduce their consumption by 50% below that 2018 baseline we set, that EUI of 92 by 2030. Eliminate fossil fuel combustion by 2045, which is actually a state goal for the state of California, but they would do it anyway. And then achieve an average portfolio site energy use intensity of 25 kilobtu per square foot per year by 2045. So they will be zero energy and carbon neutral. If you want to go to the next slide, which is a projected energy savings of about $350,000 per year if they just meet their 2030 goals. And again, that's based on some 2017 to 2020 cost averages. It could change around a little bit depending on energy pricing, but it does kind of take into account the volatility of energy pricing and demand charges. And especially because reducing energy by that 50% reduces your peak demand costs dramatically. So imagine what your district or your local district or any of the other districts in the nation can do for their pocketbooks, and then also for their emissions reductions. And I think that's it.
Yeah, so let's talk about the national movement. How are we doing, Jonathan, on sort of getting attention and momentum going with climate action in schools?
Great. That EUI concept for buildings is such a big one. Like, as a relative new person in this space, like I've learned to think of it like miles per gallon for a car, EUI for a building. And I think about all the any climate action, K12 climate action advocates out there. As Riley said, I really encourage you to like just ask, does your district have an EUI target for your, for your buildings? And I wouldn't have known how to ask that question or frame that question until I started learning about what Riley and her crew and Anissa are doing. So as we look toward 2022, we think there's some real reasons to be optimistic and some momentum and opportunity for action. We have national leadership, we have resource flows, and we have a really strong community of partners rolling up their sleeves and working to partner with school leaders and educators. So why don't can we dive in on that? I want to share some of it. So first of all, President Biden's Day 1 executive order on climate requires every federal agency to write an ambitious new climate plan. In September, U.S. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona released the U.S. Department of Education's plan with commitments to a powerful set of actions that, if effectively implemented with urgency, will put the department on a path to strong climate leadership. The plan acknowledges that climate change is no longer a theoretical threat to the department's core mission, but rather a present and a grave one. And Secretary Cardona named Deputy Secretary Cindy Martin to lead the department's climate work and the implementation of the plan. Next slide. Also, the same month in September, the K12 Climate Action Commission at the Aspen Institute released a landmark report identifying opportunities for the education sector to take action, advance climate solutions, and prepare today's students to lead a sustainable future. And the report was built out by 21 commissioners, including student leaders, the presidents of both of the country's major teachers unions, superintendents from around the country, and was co-chaired by former U.S. Secretary of Education John King, a Democrat, and former New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman, a Republican. And it includes recommendations for state, federal, and local governments, highlights opportunities for all kinds of stakeholders, business, philanthropy, communications, advocates to support the education sector in taking climate action, and really commend this report to all of you to check out if you haven't seen it yet. We also have resources in the system right now that we can use to make a down payment on K12 climate action. So as Riley and Anissa have shared, we've got 42 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents every year from our buildings in K12. And over the last 12 months, Congress has appropriated $176 billion in COVID relief funds to school districts. And these relief funds offer an opportunity to invest in facilities retrofits, because there's a strong nexus and intersection between the kinds of retrofits we need to do to make schools safe and healthy for kids in the midst of a pandemic, think indoor air quality, and the energy efficiency work we want to do, for buildings. When you go back to Riley's framework around the foundations for building decarbonization, just about everything on that list on the far left side on sort of the energy efficiency stuff, districts can use these resources for those kinds of projects because they also relate to needs in the pandemic. And by the way, these funds are also an opportunity to invest in professional learning, curriculum, place-based learning, community-based partnerships to support social emotional learning, build resilience, and prepare students to thrive in a changing climate. We also have another flow of resources for our buses, which I'm not sure if we shared this earlier, but we estimate is about 12 million metric tons of annual emissions from school buses. And the recently passed bipartisan infrastructure bill includes $5.5 billion for zero emission buses. So we can make some progress in moving things forward with what is, as I think Riley mentioned, the largest mass transit fleet in the country. So it's just really clear that over the next decade, schools will be key sites of job creation and clean energy deployment in every community in America. And finally, this next slide is just far from a comprehensive sample, but it's a really powerful community of talent-filled organizations working with schools and school systems to advance K12 climate action. So, these are some of the groups that we've been collaborating with, and the list is even much longer than could fit on the slide. So I think I want to try to close with just two last thoughts. And so, as I shared at the beginning of this conversation, this is my first year, plus as a climate advocate. And I have just a few reflections for others out there who are on their own journeys and finding their way on behalf of children and communities. So at Undaunted, we're trying to bring unapologetic ambition. This is an emergency. And it's okay to push up against people thinking you might be a little crazy, or even you thinking yourself that you might be a little crazy in what you are asking for, which is related to we need to take risks. Not acting is worse. It's better to try and then learn and then try again. And we need to ask big. We need to not negotiate with ourselves based on what we think might be feasible. We have to ask for what is needed. And finally, in this space, I feel so fortunate, and that slide with the ecosystems really kind of illustrates it. There is a growing K12 climate action community that is an incredibly fierce and dedicated and creative, generous crew. And as the saying goes, if we want to go far, we need to go together. And so just encourage people within that community and broadly to continue, reaching out to support each other. We've got a lot of work to do. And it is the most important work of our lives this decade. And finally, we wanted to lift up this quote from Andrew Brennan. He's a co-founder of the Kentucky Student Voice team who was highlighted in the Aspen report. And it speaks to the power of the school community to foster intergenerational learning and partnership for local action. So to the young people listening who are passionate about protecting the climate and their communities, but don't know where to start, look to your schools. There is work to be done. And to the adults listening who believe in the role of our education, who believe in the role our education system must play in addressing climate change and preparing citizens to participate robustly in our democracy, find ways to partner with young people in your community. You have as much to learn from them as they do from you. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think we should leave it there and on that powerful note. I invite any questions that those on the Zoom might have. We also wanted to share our emails so that you can reach out to us and our organizations, ask resources, ask for any of the links or the reports that you saw in this presentation. Please feel free to reach out. We're happy to share. As Jonathan was pointing out so eloquently, this is a community of practice around K12 climate action that is ready to pull in whoever wants to do the work. There's a lot of work to be done, and we are happy to have additional interest and additional advocates in our midst. So thank you all for joining us today. We're so happy to have you with us, and please be in touch if you have any ideas, suggestions, or additional resources that we should know about. So thank you all.